Hey guys, welcome to Sports Spectrum. I am Jason Romano, and today we are joined and welcome back, actually, a guest who's been on previously. His name is Chris Singleton, former pro baseball player, played his college ball at Charleston Southern University, and he's actually got a new book out, and he's working with the Charleston River Dogs as well. And lots going on with Chris, and we just welcome him to the show. Chris, welcome back to Sports Spectrum, buddy.
Thank you for having me, Jason. I truly appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm glad we were able to connect again, a second time. Certainly when you came on last year on our podcast and shared your story, it was a powerful one. And I loved seeing all that God was doing and transitioning you away from baseball, from pro baseball, from playing it to working. And you now work with the Charleston River Dogs, but there's no baseball right now. So it's got to be weird right now for you, I would have to imagine, just in the role that you're in and keeping busy.
Yeah, it is a little bit different for me. But honestly, I'm the director of community outreach, so the community doesn't really stop as far as reaching out. And we did some
Yeah.
things with Meals on Wheels, different things with the hospitals here. So, lucky enough, I've still been able to be here and do the things that I can in the community.
That's awesome. Now you're also an author. Did you ever think I'd be introducing you as Chris Singleton, the author?
No, no, not at all. Honestly, this was never something that I saw in my future. But I think sometimes God says, you thought you were going here, but I'm taking you there. So that's what's happening right now.
Well, I can relate to that. Let me tell you something, because if you ever said to me 5, 6, 7 years ago that I would be an author as well, I would have laughed at you because that was not taking place. But here we are, both of us being authors. And your book, it's a kid's book. It's called Different, a story about loving your neighbor. There's never a more timely book, I think, than right now. You and I were talking before we started recording about pre-orders, and it's really God's doing some amazing things with this book. Can you share a little bit about the heart of it, why you wanted to write this, and kind of how it came about? Again, it's called Different, a story about loving your neighbor.
Yeah, man, I call it God's timing. It's crazy. I started about a year and a half ago. Me and my little sister. I told her that I wanted to write a children's book because I go speak to high schools, middle schools, and colleges and companies about my mom being murdered because she was black. But when I speak to kids, elementary school students about that, I felt like I was taking their innocence away. And so I try to figure out how can I keep spreading that message of love and unity without telling my personal story of my mom being murdered the way she was. So a kid's book was the thing my sister suggested. And I said, all right, I'm going to do it. And so I just, kept working hard, asking a million questions because I had no idea what I was doing. And then God connected me with the right people. And here we are. Here it is.
That's awesome. It's available on Amazon, and I just ordered it right before we started, so I'm excited to get my copy. You can also find it at loveyourneighborbrand.com, loveyourneighborbrand.com. And like I said, it's on Amazon. Really looking forward to this. I think it's going to help a lot of people. And, the current climate that we're in, obviously, is one that's, I don't know what the right word is, but there's a lot of division, I guess we'll say, with all that took place since the death of George Floyd. And a book like this, from so many people that I've heard, that I've talked to, especially my Black brothers and sisters, they've said it really starts at home with how you talk to your kids and having these conversations. Was that a little bit maybe the influence in terms of writing a book like this, that it allows us to have these conversations? If my daughter was 4 or 5, I could get her this book and read it to her and allow even then to understand the conversations that we can have about loving your neighbor.
Yeah, I think for me, my biggest thing, that's why I just keep saying it's God's timing, because I was writing these discussion questions in January when I told my editor, hey, we have to get this book out by June 17th. That's the 5-year date of when my mom was murdered. And I wanted to be some smiles on that day rather than just tears and sadness. So I felt like that'd be really huge. And all of a sudden, everything that happened with, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, everything that's happening, it's like, wow, I don't think that was just me that was saying we need to have it out by June 17th. I think that was, God saying, no, Chris, we need to have that book out then. Like you said, it starts at home. I always say there's 3 things everybody can do. One is just check yourself, check your heart, look in the mirror and say, why do I believe what I believe? And why do I think this way? And secondly, teach your kids. And that's what this book can do. It teaches your kids to love people of different races, religions, cultures. Last but not least, I think the third thing we can all do is simply love our neighbor. Doesn't The Bible doesn't say love your neighbor if he looks like you or if she has the same hair color or texture as you. The Bible says, love your neighbor. So that's the three things I think everybody can do.
I completely agree. And actually was tweeting about that this morning, about just that verse, love your neighbor as yourself. And, Jesus says those words. So when he speaks, we should all be listening, especially as believers. And that neighbor idea of what you just said is not just our next door neighbor as I look out to my neighbors outside of my house, but literally every single person we come in contact with, that we're to love them as we love ourselves. Chris Singleton's our guest here today on Sports Spectrum. You mentioned 5 years. And I actually said the word anniversary, and I apologize to you because that's not the proper word, I don't think, but it has been 5 years since your mom was killed, June 17th, 2015 at Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. And my wife and I, we've been wanting to have conversations as well about all that's been going on in terms of the racial unrest. And I said, well, let me go back and see if the Emanuel documentary is available to watch. And lo and behold, it was on Amazon Prime to watch for free this past weekend. And we went and watched it, and we just walked away. I think it opened up a dialogue. Not that my wife and I don't talk, obviously, but it just opened up a dialogue to understand that some of the things that we're having conversations about right now were being had 5 years ago. And for some reason, we're still having these conversations. What comes to your mind when obviously a lot has to come to your mind when you think back 5 years ago, but just the initial thoughts and conversations, because the documentary portrays you beautifully in choosing forgiveness pretty quickly. And that always blew my mind as a guy who wrote a book on forgiveness, how you could forgive the person who kills your mother that quickly. Can you kind of take us back a little bit, just some of the thoughts and emotions that were going through your mind, and certainly maybe that are coming to your mind now as you look back?
Yeah, when I forgave my mother's killer, not even 48 hours after my mom was killed, I always say that it had to be God on my heart because I'm 18 years old, right? My mom is my breadwinner; she's everything for me and my family. And for me to say those words, we already forgive them. And my sister kind of looks at me like I'm crazy when I say that.
Yeah.
I realized that it was God speaking through me. There's no other question about it. Now, a practical way that I kind of teach now is, and I'm sure you've done the same, is when we think about forgiveness, we have to remember that we're doing it for ourselves, to free ourselves of that grief, that constant feeling of revenge or anger or whatever it may be. But I think you've kind of unlocked that and sharing some things. And I think that's the key when we talk about forgiveness. Think about it for ourselves rather than just for the person that hurt us.
Did you allow yourself, or did bitterness or anger or any of those words that I talk about a lot that you just mentioned, did those ever creep in at all? Or was it really so rock solid in terms of the foundation that you had built from your mom and from God to allow you to just forgive pretty instantly?
And I would consider myself a believer before then, but I didn't have a personal relationship with God, right? I was one of those believers that just believed because my mom was a believer or my grandmother is always singing about the Lord, right? That's who I was. So for me to say I had this super solid foundation in my faith for when that happened, I couldn't really say that. That actually strengthened my faith because I always say there's two things you can do when something like that happens to you, right? My mother was murdered in a church while she's praying. I can either say there's no way God is real because this happened, or I could say, God, I don't know how this happened, but I need you to get me through it. And I went with the latter, and God got me through that, and He's still getting me through it. But I wouldn't say there was any anger like towards anything, but I will say I was upset, and I'm still upset to this day. If you lose a loved one in that manner and you're not upset, then I don't understand how you're a human being. That's kind of what has led me to doing the work that I do now, is because I'm so upset that my mom was murdered, just based on the race of her, or the color of her skin.
Yeah. Chris Singleton is joining us here on Sports Spectrum. So when you saw Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and all that's happened since, certainly those were horrific incidents that happened, the murders of those three people. And we're having these conversations, and it seems like this is different. And I feel like, I hate even saying this, but it should have been different 5 years ago, when we saw what happened and that people were just praying and in their church, and then all of a sudden a straight race crime happens and a murder and the innocent people, their lives taken. Like, I feel like the conversations that we're having now should have taken place then. And maybe they were on some level, but it feels like it's escalated a lot over the past few weeks. What's been some of the things you've been thinking about over the last few weeks since everything that took place, really most recently with the murder of George Floyd?
Yeah, you see, I had the opportunity to peacefully march here in Charleston, with the Black Lives Matter. And it was crazy because, Charleston's history obviously is slavery. So many of the slaves brought to the States came through Charleston. And so there's that history here. But when we were out there marching peacefully during that morning, I kept seeing people of different races. There was, I think they said the numbers were 70% of the march, people that were marching were white, that were chanting Black Lives Matter. And so, I think there's so much good that is coming from this, even though a lot of people are focused on the bad. I think that anytime you see people of, different races or speaking different languages in different countries, rallying behind people that don't look like them, fighting for them, I think that's powerful, man. And so that's what I've seen over the last couple of weeks. I've seen some good and some bad. But most importantly, I think a lot of people are being held accountable for what they say. And a lot of people are watching the things that they put into the atmosphere and into the world right now, which should have happened a long time ago.
Take me back to the initial, weeks and months after everything that happened with your mom and at the church 5 years ago, but months and months after that, were you seeing or beginning to see or trying to have the conversations that seem to be taking place now?
Yeah, for me, I don't shy away from speaking about race at all. I'm really blatant in the fact when I tell somebody what happened to my mom, I say she was murdered based on the color of her skin. Like a young white man wanted to start a race war in our country, and so he took 9 lives while they were worshiping. Like, I don't shy away from that at all. It's
Yeah.
real life, and it happened to me. So the conversations were happening on my end for a while, but I think when something like what has recently happened with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, the list goes on. Just recently, I think when we see that, there's so many other people that are joining in on that conversation, and it's very hard to just stay silent right now. I think there's a lot of peer pressure going on to not stay silent, and I don't think that's a bad thing. A lot of people have said I don't think it's genuine, but something that's I've been thinking is, well, if you say something now, I think people are going to be able to call you out in a couple months if you don't do anything. So, I think it's easy to post something, but rather than doing nothing, I'd rather people do something.
Have you seen people reaching out to you to have more conversations now, maybe than they even reached out to you 5 years ago, because of all of the climate that we're in? And suddenly you're hearing from different people, maybe that you haven't heard from in a while. Maybe consider me one of those people, right? Reaching out to you for an interview. But have you seen conversations start to take place that you haven't been having in a while?
Yeah, well, I think, for me, the conversations haven't stopped. They're more frequent now than they were before. But for me, I've been sharing this message for the last 4 years after my mom was killed. And so I guess a lot of people are reaching out to me personally, but I wouldn't say that they haven't been doing so before. It's just a little bit more frequent now. Whereas before, when they would reach out to me, it was to comfort me, praying for me. And now they're asking, Chris, it's happened. So, how can I help? What do I do?
Your faith, you mentioned that you didn't really have a personal relationship with Jesus when your mom passed, when she was murdered. And you said you grew in that and you learned. And it wasn't just a faith that was your parents or your mom or your grandmother, but it was yours. And, something that you had to make personal for you. So you have that now. Tell me how that fuels you and really forms how you go about and why you go about still continuing to speak out. How is Christ, I guess, being the center of your life, fueling you and to keep speaking out?
Yeah, I think for one, I think there's no way I'd be able to speak about my mom being killed if I didn't have Jesus in my life. It'd be way too painful. Even today, sometimes when I'm sharing, I get a lump in my throat. So it's not like I never feel that way. I actually just got done sharing a message this past weekend at a church. And it was the first time in a while. Uh, I got kind of choked up during it, but and have that personal relationship, I pull from that for my strength. I don't just try to rely on myself because I know if it's just me, there's no way I'd be able to speak about the terrible things that's happened to my mom, my family.
Last question, and it's really a question that I've asked a bunch of different people in the last couple of weeks. But what conversations should I be having with people? What questions should I be asking? Where are we right now in terms of me as a middle-aged white man who wants to learn, wants to grow, wants to be better, wants to be more empathetic, wants to see change, and doesn't want to see anything like what we saw 5 years ago or what we saw 5 months ago or 2 months ago? I don't want that, obviously, but what kind of questions and things should I be asking, and should my fellow white men and women be asking during a time like this?
Yeah, well, I think for the first time, a lady who I don't know, she's a business owner here in Charleston, reached out to me and basically said, "Chris, after Ahmaud Arbery was shot and killed, was the first time that I put myself in the shoes of a black woman." She's a white lady, and
Hmm.
she said, there was a black woman in her neighborhood who had kids. They were twins, and they were running, in the morning, and that woman sent out a message through the Facebook, you know I guess, neighborhood chat,
Like
right?
a
And she
group?
said,
Yeah.
yeah, like the group. And she said, "Hey, my sons are going to be running this morning. They're going to military college next year. Just letting you guys know." And the wife, the white woman who I was speaking to, said that her husband immediately commented, "Wow, my son is going to that military college as well. Maybe they can run together." Right? Had no idea why she was saying that. And here, the woman who I was talking to, the white woman, said to her husband, "Hey, do you know why she said that?" And the husband had no idea. He's simply going about his day. Oh, they're going to the same military college. Maybe somebody can run with them.
Yeah.
And she said, "No, she's terrified." She said, "For the first time, I'm thinking, what if that were, my son?" And she said she'd never put herself in the shoes of a black woman until after that murder. And so I think with so many different people, stuff like that needs to happen. What if it's your spouse? Maybe put yourself in the shoes of somebody of color, and have that conversation with your spouse like this woman did. Or for me, I'm so big on teaching our kids. As a middle-aged dad, you might have kids that are in middle school, high school, elementary school, and what do your kids' friends look like? Do they all look like you? Do they all look like the people in your neighborhood, or do they? What does that look like? For me, being a baseball player, there wasn't a ton of African American baseball players on my team, so I would go over to my friend's house and they would say, "Wow, this is the first time I ever had a black person over my house," and that's kind of weird to me. But it's true for a lot of people. And so I definitely think to grow, we need to make sure our community or our household doesn't just look like the people that we see in the mirror.
Mm. Here's Chris Singleton, my friend. Thank you. Obviously, I know it's a tough time in terms of having to think back 5 years ago, but you're doing a lot of good. I know you're making your mom proud, and certainly this new book is such a cool way to go about doing that. It's called Different: A Story About Loving Your Neighbor, and it's out now. I should say out on June 17th, and that's today as we release this. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it everywhere books are found. And it's just really cool to see what God's doing in your life, my friend. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for coming on. And thanks for helping us learn, because we want to get better. And certainly as a nation, I think the best way that we can honor Christ is by loving our neighbor as ourselves. Chris Singleton, thanks, brother. Appreciate you.
Thank you for having me, man. Appreciate it.
And